My husband walked into our luxury beachfront resort with his assistant on his arm, introducing her as his special guest to everyone at the family reunion. 20 minutes later, he was staring at property deeds and ownership documents, his face drained of all color. The look in his eyes when he realized I owned the entire resort where he planned his affair getaway? Absolutely priceless. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story resonates with you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The oceanfront terrace of the Sapphire Bay Resort had always been my favorite spot on the property, a place of breathtaking beauty and tranquility. Endless azure waters stretched to the horizon, palm trees swayed in the gentle breeze, and the sound of waves created a soothing rhythm that had calmed me through both celebrations and heartaches. Today, that same rhythm helped steady my nerves. As I prepared for the storm I knew was coming. I stood at the balustrade, my fingers absently tracing the smooth marble as I watched new arrivals make their way up the grand driveway. My heart wasn't racing anymore. That phase had passed days ago when I discovered the truth. Now a strange calm had settled over me, the kind that comes after a storm when everything is broken, but oddly peaceful. "Victoria, is everything all right?" My mother, Elena's voice came from behind me, gentle and concerned. She'd noticed something was off the moment she arrived yesterday. My usual enthusiasm for our annual family gathering replaced by quiet determination. "Everything's fine, Mom," I replied, turning to face her with a practiced smile I'd perfected over the past 8 years of marriage to James. Outwardly serene while inside pieces of myself were slowly chipping away. Elena studied my face, unconvinced. After 35 years as a therapist specializing in relationship counseling, she could spot emotional armor from a mile away. "You know you can tell me anything, sweetheart." For a moment, I considered confessing everything, about finding the messages, the late-night calls, the unfamiliar perfume, about discovering that my husband had been having an affair with his executive assistant Melanie for the past 10 months, about the portfolio tucked discreetly in my beach bag containing documents that would forever change our family dynamic within the hour. Instead, I simply nodded. "I know, Mom. Let's make sure everything's ready. They'll be here soon." The "they" hung in the air between us. Elena didn't know that James and Melanie would be arriving together, that my husband had decided our annual family reunion at Sapphire Bay Resort was the perfect opportunity to introduce his affair partner as a special colleague to everyone. He thought I was still in the dark, oblivious to his betrayal. He had no idea I was 3 steps ahead. I moved around the terrace, making minor adjustments to the welcome cocktail setup. 16 glasses for 16 family members. My parents, James's parents, my brother Nicholas and his wife, James's brother Timothy and his husband, my elderly aunt and uncle, my cousins Sophia and Olivia with their partners, and of course, James, Melanie, and me, one big happy family. Except 3 of these people had been keeping a secret. Melanie, obviously, James, without question, but also Timothy, James's brother, who had known about the affair for months but said nothing, even going so far as to cover for them during a business trip that never actually happened. The betrayal ran deeper than just my marriage. The sound of a luxury car approaching sent a jolt through my body despite my preparation. I took a deep breath, smoothing the front of my white sundress, James's favorite, and tucking a strand of hair behind my ear. The portfolio seemed to pulse with energy from inside my beach bag. "I'll greet them," I called out, moving toward the grand entrance with measured steps. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the lobby, I could make out two silhouettes stepping out of the car, standing too close, too familiar. My hand hesitated on the door handle for just a second before I pulled it open, my smile firmly in place. "Welcome to Sapphire Bay," I said, my voice steady. James stood there, his arm casually wrapped around Melanie's waist. My husband, the successful investment banker whose ambition I had supported for 8 years, stood tall and confident in designer resort wear. Melanie, 10 years younger than me, with the kind of effortless beauty that came from both good genes and expensive treatments, had the decency to look uncomfortable, her eyes darting everywhere but at my face. James, however, met my gaze with a strange mix of defiance and apology. "Victoria," he said, his voice carrying a rehearsed quality. "We need to talk." I stepped aside, allowing them into the resort. "Yes," I agreed. "We certainly do." As they moved past me into the lobby, I caught the faint scent of Melanie's perfume, an exclusive French brand I had introduced her to during last year's office Christmas party. The irony wasn't lost on me. My mother emerged from the terrace, stopping abruptly at the sight of James and Melanie together. Her eyes widened, darting between them, then to me, questions forming on her lips. "Mom," I said before she could speak, "James has something he wants to share with everyone during our welcome dinner. We should wait until everyone's here." Elena's gaze hardened as she looked at James, maternal instinct kicking in. In that moment, I knew she understood exactly what was happening, and I felt a surge of gratitude for the unconditional support I saw in her eyes. "Of course," she said coolly. "The welcome cocktails will be ready in 20 minutes. James, why don't you and Melanie check into your rooms? The others should be arriving shortly." As they moved toward the reception desk, Elena pulled me aside, her voice a whisper. "Victoria, what's going on? Are you okay?" I squeezed her hand reassuringly. "I will be, Mom, I promise. I've got this under control." And I did. For the first time in years, I felt completely in control of my life. The weight of suspicion and uncertainty had been lifted the moment I discovered the truth. Now there was only the path forward, my path, without James, without the constant doubt and diminishment that had become the backdrop of my marriage. The next hour passed in a blur of arrivals, forced pleasantries, and curious glances. Nicholas arrived with his wife, immediately sensing the tension in the air. James's parents followed, his father Richard clapping James on the shoulder while his mother Diana embraced Melanie with familiar affection that made my stomach turn. They knew too. The circle of deception widened with each new arrival. By the time we all gathered on the oceanfront terrace for welcome cocktails, the air was thick with unspoken questions. I took my position near the bar, opposite my father, who always officiated our family gatherings. James hesitated before standing beside me, Melanie taking a place next to him instead of mingling with the other guests, a visible declaration. As my father began his traditional welcome toast, I reached for my beach bag beside my chair, my fingers closing around the portfolio. The moment of truth was approaching, and with it, my liberation. I'd always been the steady one, the planner, the woman with the detailed itineraries and color-coded schedules. Victoria Mercer, née Collins, raised in a comfortable suburban neighborhood where my parents had lived in the same Mediterranean-style home for over 40 years. The house with the jacaranda trees in the front yard, and the pool where my father had taught me to swim, faded but sturdy, like the family values they had instilled in me. At 36, I had built a life that looked perfect from the outside. A respected position as the director of a nonprofit focused on financial literacy for underserved communities. A beautiful beachfront condo in a desirable neighborhood, a husband of 8 years who worked at one of the city's most prestigious investment firms. We were the couple friends pointed to and said, "They've got it all figured out." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. What they didn't see were the cracks forming beneath the polished surface, the way James's ambition had gradually twisted into something darker, more selfish, the way his compliments had evolved into subtle criticisms, always delivered with a smile. "You look nice today, Victoria. That dress almost distracts from how tired you've been looking lately." Or, "Good job on that fundraiser for your little charity. Maybe next time try to connect with some serious donors, though. You tend to aim too small." Little by little, those comments had chipped away at my confidence, my sense of self. I'd started dressing differently, speaking differently, even thinking differently, all in an effort to meet James's ever-shifting standards. "James, tell us about that new client you mentioned last month," my father prompted, drawing me back to the present. "The international one?" "It's going exceptionally well," James replied, setting down his cocktail glass. "In fact, that's partly why Melanie is here. She's been instrumental in coordinating all the moving pieces." "How fortunate," my mother commented, her smile not quite reaching her eyes. "Your firm must be pleased with both of you." "They are," James responded, his confidence growing as he discussed his work. "In fact, I've been put in charge of their entire portfolio. It's a significant responsibility." I watched him as he spoke, animated and engaging. This was the James I had fallen in love with 10 years ago, passionate about his work, charming, focused. We'd met at a charity gala where my nonprofit was being honored. I was there accepting an award. He was there representing his firm as a sponsor. He'd approached me as I stood alone by the dessert table, contemplating a chocolate truffle. "Life's too short not to indulge occasionally," he'd said, standing close enough that I could smell his cologne. I'd been intrigued by his directness, by the intensity in his deep brown eyes. We'd spent the rest of the evening discussing finance, philanthropy, and our shared love of coastal living. By the end of the night, I'd given him my card, something I rarely did. By the end of the month, we were inseparable. The James standing before me now, casually discussing his career achievements while his hand occasionally brushed against my assistant's arm, was a stranger wearing my husband's face. "And what about you, Melanie?" Nicholas asked, his tone deliberately casual, though his eyes were sharp. My brother had always been protective of me, and I suspected he'd picked up on the unusual dynamics at play. "I heard Victoria gave you a promotion recently to senior program assistant. Enjoying the transition to a leadership role?" Melanie flushed slightly, glancing at James before answering. "Actually, I've moved departments. I'm working directly with James now as his executive assistant." "Executive assistant?" my mother echoed, her eyebrow raised. "I thought you were passionate about nonprofit work, about Victoria's financial literacy programs." "I am," Melanie replied quickly. "This is just a new opportunity with better advancement potential. Right, James?" "That's right," I interjected, my voice calm despite the accelerated beating of my heart. "Melanie has been advancing quite rapidly in recent months. Haven't you, Mel?" A moment of silence fell over the terrace. James's parents exchanged glances. Timothy suddenly became very interested in the garnish of his cocktail, cutting the lime wedge into perfectly equal pieces. "Melanie's been an invaluable asset," James finally said, his voice steady, but his fingers tightening around his glass. "She has a natural talent for anticipating needs." "I'm sure she does," I replied, taking a sip of my water. The conversation shifted to safer topics: the unusually perfect weather, Nicholas's new position at the hospital, my aunt's upcoming Alaskan cruise. But the undercurrent remained electric and unavoidable. Everyone was waiting for the other shoe to drop. I thought about the night I discovered the truth. It had been so ordinary, so mundane. James was working late, as he often did. I was organizing our shared cloud storage, a task I'd been putting off for months. The shared album had synced new photos automatically, and when I opened it to create a better filing system, there they were. Dozens of pictures of James and Melanie that had nothing to do with work. Dinners at intimate restaurants, walks, on beaches, even one of them kissing outside a hotel I recognized as the boutique property, where James claimed he'd attended a weekend conference alone. I'd stared at those images, my mind racing to find an innocent explanation, but there was none. The suspicion that had been growing in the back of my mind for months suddenly crystallized into certainty. I hadn't cried. I hadn't screamed or thrown things or called him in a rage. Instead, I'd methodically documented everything, downloading the photos to my secure drive, then cross-referenced them with James's calendar and expense reports that I had access to as his spouse. I discovered hotel charges, dinner receipts, even a weekend trip to a vineyard, all carefully disguised as business expenses. The next morning, I'd called my mother's friend, a discreet but highly effective private investigator. By the end of the week, I had a comprehensive file of evidence. And when James mentioned our upcoming family reunion at Sapphire Bay, casually suggesting that he might bring Melanie because she's practically family at this point, I knew exactly what he was planning. So I made plans of my own. "Victoria," Diana, James's mother, said, drawing my attention back to the gathering. "You're quiet tonight. Is everything all right?" I smiled at my mother-in-law, the woman who had welcomed me into her family with open arms, who had shared family recipes and traditions, and who had apparently known for months that her son was betraying me. "I'm fine, Diana," I replied. "Just thinking about Revelations, how sometimes the truth has been right in front of us all along, but we choose not to see it." Diana's smile faltered. She glanced at her husband, then at James, who had stopped mid-conversation and was staring intently at me. "Sometimes," I continued, my voice carrying clearly around the suddenly quiet terrace, "we think we know the people closest to us, only to discover we never really knew them at all." "Victoria," James said, a warning note in his voice. "What is it, James?" I asked, turning to face him fully. "Is there something you'd like to share with everyone? Something about you and Melanie?" The terrace fell completely silent. All eyes moved between James, Melanie, and me. This was the moment, the precipice I'd been moving toward since the night I discovered their betrayal. There was no turning back now. The tension around the oceanfront terrace was palpable as all eyes fixed on James. He straightened in his chair, clearing his throat as he set down his cocktail with deliberate precision. This was a man accustomed to controlling the narrative, to having everyone hang on his words during investor meetings and board presentations. But for once, I had seized the script from him, and his momentary fluster revealed how unprepared he was for this deviation from his carefully orchestrated plan. "I was going to wait until dinner," James said, his voice regaining its usual confidence. But since Victoria has brought it up, he reached for Melanie's hand, placing it atop the table for everyone to see. Melanie and I have developed feelings for each other over the past several months working together. We didn't plan for this to happen, but we've decided to be honest about our relationship. Melanie's face flushed as she stared down at her barely touched cocktail. At least she had the decency to look uncomfortable. Honest, the word escaped my lips as a half laugh. That's an interesting choice of words, James. My mother set down her glass with enough force that water splashed over the rim. James, are you telling us that you've been having an affair with Melanie, with Victoria's assistant? James met my mother's gaze with practiced sincerity. Elena, I know this is difficult to hear. Victoria and I have grown apart over the past couple of years. We've been living separate lives under the same roof. What Melanie and I have found together is real connection, something that's been missing from my marriage for a long time. I marveled at how easily he rewrote our history, painting our marriage as a hollow shell, when just last month we'd hosted his colleagues for dinner. His arm draped possessively around my shoulders as he'd introduced me as my brilliant wife, the backbone of my success. The same month he'd taken Melanie to a beachfront hotel only 20 miles from our condo. How long? My father's voice cut through the terrace, deep and controlled but with an edge I rarely heard. How long has this been going on, James? James shifted slightly in his chair. Dad, I understand you're upset. I'm not your dad, my father interrupted coldly. Answer the question. Melanie spoke for the first time, her voice small. 10 months. 10 months, I repeated, nodding slowly. 10 months during which James and I celebrated our 8th anniversary, during which we discussed having children, during which I helped Melanie get promoted to senior program assistant at my nonprofit before she suddenly transferred to James's department. Timothy, James's brother, suddenly looked ill. He had known all along. I'd seen the text exchanges on James's cloud backup where he'd confided in Timothy, where Timothy had offered advice on letting Victoria down easy when the time came. Victoria? James's voice softened as he turned to me, adopting the sympathetic tone he used with difficult clients. I never meant to hurt you. These things, they just happen sometimes. People change, they grow apart. I think deep down, you felt it too. 5 years earlier, I might have believed him. 3 years earlier, I might have blamed myself, wondering what I'd done wrong, how I'd failed to keep his interest. 1 year earlier, I might have broken down in tears, begging him to reconsider, to give our marriage another chance. But the Victoria sitting at the table that evening was not the same woman who had walked down the aisle in an ivory gown with stars in her eyes. That Victoria had gradually disappeared, eroded by 1,000 small moments of dismissal, of subtle undermining, of being made to feel that her thoughts and feelings were somehow less valid than his. The James I married had been charming, attentive, passionate about his work, but equally invested in our relationship. He brought me coffee in bed every Sunday morning. He listened attentively when I talked about my nonprofit work. He made plans for our future that always included we and us and our. But somewhere along the way, things had shifted. The change was so gradual I barely noticed it happening. The Sunday coffees became less frequent, then stopped altogether. My stories about work were interrupted with his more important client anecdotes. Our future plans became his career trajectory, with my role reduced to supportive spouse. What exactly did you think would happen tonight, James? I asked, genuinely curious. You bring my assistant to our family reunion, announce you're leaving me for her, and then what? We all enjoy Mai Tais by the pool together? James's jaw tightened. This wasn't going according to his script. I thought we could discuss this. Like adults, Victoria. I was planning to tell you privately before dinner, but you were busy with the welcome arrangements. How considerate of you, I replied. And where were you planning to have this private conversation? In the honeymoon suite you booked for yourself and Melanie, or perhaps on the same beach where we took our engagement photos? Melanie shifted, uncomfortably beside him. Maybe we should continue this another time, she suggested quietly. This is a family gathering, and what exactly do you think you are, Melanie? Nicholas interjected, his patience visibly fraying. You worked? For my sister. She mentored you, recommended you for promotion, invited you to family events. Did that not factor into your decision at any point during these 10 months? Melanie flinched as if she'd been slapped. Tears welled in her eyes, and for a brief moment, I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. Diana finally broke her silence. James, this isn't how we raised you, she said, disappointment evident in her voice. You've handled this terribly. Mom, please, James replied, exasperation creeping into his tone. I'm trying to do the right thing by being honest now. Now? My father's laugh was harsh. After 10 months? That's not honesty, son. That's damage control because you got caught. I didn't get caught, James insisted, glancing at me with sudden suspicion. Victoria and I have been having problems for a long time. This isn't about Melanie. This is about our marriage not working anymore. It was always the same with James. Reframe the narrative, shift the blame, make it seem like circumstances beyond his control had forced his hand. In his mind, he was always the reasonable one, the victim of others' emotions or expectations. I'd watched him do it for years with clients, with colleagues, with friends. I just never thought I'd be on the receiving end of his manipulation so blatantly. Our marriage not working anymore, I repeated thoughtfully. Is that the phrase you settled on? Not, I betrayed my wife with her assistant, or I've been lying to everyone for the better part of a year? Victoria, you're making this more difficult than it needs to be, James said, his patience visibly thinning. People fall out of love. Marriages end. It happens every day. You're right, I agreed, surprising him. It does happen every day. In fact, it's happening right now. This was it, the moment I'd been planning for since discovering those photos. I reached down beside my chair for my beach bag, feeling the weight of the portfolio inside. 8 years of marriage reduced to legal documents and property deeds. James's eyes followed my movement, a flicker of uncertainty crossing his face. This wasn't part of his plan. In his version of tonight's events, he would reveal his relationship with Melanie. I would be stunned and emotional, and he would magnanimously offer to give me time to process. He would appear reasonable while I appeared hysterical. He would control the narrative while I struggled to catch up. But I was already 5 steps ahead of him. And for the first time in our marriage, James was about to discover what it felt like to be completely blindsided. The terrace fell silent as I pulled the portfolio from my beach bag. It made a soft thud as I placed it on the table between the elaborate fruit platter and champagne bucket. James's eyes fixed on it, his expression shifting from confusion to dawning comprehension. "What is that?" he asked, though I could tell from the sudden pallor of his face that he already suspected something significant. "Why don't you open it and find out?" I suggested. my voice remarkably steady despite the thundering of my heart. For a moment, no one moved. The only sound was the gentle lapping of waves against the shore and the distant call of seabirds overhead, marking the seconds of this suspended moment. Then, slowly, James reached for the portfolio, his fingers hesitating before finally grasping it. I watched as he opened the leather cover and slid out the documents, their crisp official letterhead stark against the tropical hardwood of the dining table. His eyes scanned the first page, widening slightly as they reached the bold heading. Sapphire Bay Resort Holdings LLC, Certificate of Ownership. Property deeds, he said flatly, looking up at me with genuine shock. To the resort? Not just deeds, I confirmed. Ownership documents. I own Sapphire Bay Resort, James. I've owned it for the past 3 years. James stared at me as if seeing me for the first time, the documents trembling slightly in his hands. That's impossible. This place is worth $37 million, I finished for him. Though after the renovations and expansion last year, the current valuation is closer to $42 million. My father cleared his throat, perhaps hiding a smile. Perhaps we should give you two some privacy to discuss this. That won't be necessary, Dad, I said, never taking my eyes off James. There's nothing to discuss that can't be said in front of everyone. After all, James and Melanie were planning to announce their relationship tonight. I'm simply adding my own announcement to the agenda. James shuffled through the documents, his investment banker precision reasserting itself as he methodically reviewed each page. These are legitimate, he murmured, almost to himself. Then louder, with disbelief still evident in his voice. How? We don't have this kind of money. You don't, I corrected gently. I do. The confusion on James's face deepened. But your non-profit work, your salary, is just one aspect of my life, I explained. Did you ever wonder why I was so insistent on maintaining separate finances? Why I had investments you weren't privy to? Why I spent so much time on charity work that often took me to meetings with property developers and financial institutions? Your family trust, he said slowly, the realization dawning. You told me it was modest, just enough to help with our condo down payment. I allowed myself a small smile. I may have understated things a bit. My grandfather didn't just leave me some investments when he died. He left me a substantial real estate portfolio and his property development company. I've been running it through a management team for the past decade, expanding into luxury resort properties 5 years ago. A flash of anger crossed James's face. You lied to me. Did I? I asked, raising an eyebrow. Or did I simply withhold certain financial details, much like you withheld certain details about your late nights at the office with Melanie? Nicholas coughed, likely covering a laugh. I continued, my voice steady and clear. The difference, James, is that my privacy about my finances didn't betray our marriage vows. I never once promised to disclose every asset I owned. You, however, did promise fidelity. I watched the implications settle over him like a physical weight. Not only had I caught him in his betrayal, but I'd revealed myself to be something entirely different from the supportive, financially dependent wife he thought he was leaving. The power dynamic he had so carefully cultivated over our years together had just been completely upended. How long have you known? He finally asked, setting the documents down carefully. About Melanie and me. I considered deflecting again, but something in his expression, perhaps genuine curiosity rather than his usual strategic probing, made me decide to tell him the truth. 2 months ago, I said. Your cloud storage synced photos to our shared album. All of them. The romantic dinners, the weekend getaways, the couple's massage at the spa in Palm Beach. All neatly documented with timestamps that coincided perfectly with your business trips. Melanie blanched, no doubt remembering the specific content of some of those photos. Diana shifted uncomfortably in her chair, while Timothy seemed to find his cocktail glass utterly fascinating. I see, James said after a moment, setting the ownership documents down carefully. And you've been planning this ambush ever since? There it was, the first attempt to reframe, to make me the villain in his narrative. Classic James. Ambush? I repeated, raising an eyebrow. That's an interesting characterization from the man who brought his mistress to a family reunion to announce he was leaving his wife. I was trying to be respectful, James insisted, his voice rising slightly. I wanted to tell you privately first, but then planned to be honest with everyone rather than hiding or sneaking around anymore. A bitter laugh escaped me before I could stop it. Respectful? You've been sneaking around for 10 months, James. With my assistant. In what universe is any of that respectful? James's jaw tightened, a familiar sign that his patience was wearing thin. He'd always hated being challenged, especially publicly. You know what I mean, Victoria. I was trying to handle this with dignity. Dignity? My father asked sharply. Certainly not my daughter's. Sir, with all due respect, this is between Victoria and me, James replied, his professional demeanor slipping back into place. We've grown apart. These things happen. I never intended to hurt anyone. I studied him, this man I had loved, trying to see if he genuinely believed his own words, or if he knew he was spinning fiction. It was hard to tell. James had always been skilled at convincing himself of whatever narrative best served his interests. You know what the saddest part is? I said finally. I don't even think you're lying right now. I think you've convinced yourself that this was somehow inevitable, that you had no agency in it, that it just happened, as if having an affair with my assistant for 10 months was something that occurred to you rather than something you actively chose day after day. Victoria, Melanie began, but I cut her off with a raised hand. No, Melanie, you don't get to speak right now. Not after sitting across from me at staff meetings, asking about my marriage, offering ideas for James's birthday gift, all while sleeping with my husband. You've said quite enough over the past 10 months. Melanie's face crumpled, tears spilling down her cheeks. But I felt nothing. No satisfaction, no remorse. Just a vast emptiness where my feelings for these people had once resided. James reached for the portfolio again, flipping through the pages. For a moment, I thought he might tear them in frustration. Instead, he carefully closed the leather cover and set it down between us. When he looked up, his expression had changed. The shock had faded, replaced by something cooler, more calculated. This was James the negotiator, James the strategist, the version of my husband I'd learned to be wary of over the years. So you own the resort, he said calmly. Congratulations on your success. But I fail to see how this changes our current situation. Our marriage isn't working, Victoria. This dramatic revelation doesn't change that fact. You're right, I agreed, surprising him. It doesn't change the state of our marriage. That's been broken for some time. Longer than you've been with Melanie, if we're being honest. His brow furrowed slightly, confusion momentarily replacing his calculated calm. This response wasn't part of the script he'd anticipated. What it does change, I continued, is the balance of power in what happens next. You came here thinking you were in control of the narrative, that you could orchestrate our separation on your terms. But you've been performing on my stage the entire time, James. I reached for the portfolio and extracted another document, sliding it across the table to him. This is the prenuptial agreement you insisted we sign before our wedding. Do you remember why you were so adamant about it? James's eyes narrowed as he glanced at the document. To protect our individual assets in case of divorce. Standard. Practice. Indeed, I nodded. And do you remember the infidelity clause on page 17? The one your lawyer assured you was just a formality that would likely never come into play. I watched as realization dawned on him, his fingers quickly flipping to the referenced page. The color drained from his face for the second time that evening as he read the clause he had so casually dismissed 8 years ago. A clause that now carried significant consequences. In the event of proven infidelity by either party, he read aloud, his voice growing increasingly strained. The offending party forfeits all claims to any increase in the injured party's assets or income accrued during the marriage. Your lawyer thought it was harmless because you assumed I had no significant assets, I explained. Just a non-profit director with a modest family trust. What possible financial damage could such a clause do to you? This is absurd, he protested, though with less conviction than before. No court would enforce such a punitive provision. My legal team disagrees, I replied calmly, especially given the abundant evidence of your affair, including the convenient fact that you brought your mistress to a family event and publicly announced your relationship. It's almost as if you were determined to provide incontrovertible proof of your infidelity. James set the prenup down, his strategist, mind clearly racing to find a way out of the corner he'd backed himself into. What do you want, Victoria? The question hung in the air between us, direct and revealing. In James's world, every conflict had a price, every problem a negotiated solution. 8 years of marriage reduced to a transaction. What do I want? I repeated thoughtfully. I want what I've always wanted, James. Honesty, respect, and the space to be myself without diminishment. Unfortunately, those aren't things you've been willing to provide. Don't be cryptic, he snapped, his composure slipping. If this is about money. It's never been about money, I interrupted. That's the fundamental misunderstanding at the heart of our marriage. You've always measured value in dollars and status. I've measured it in integrity and mutual respect. I stood up, smoothing the front of my white sundress. The strange calm that had sustained me throughout the confrontation remained, though now tinged with something else. A sense of lightness, of burdens being set down after being carried for too long. What I want is a clean break, I said simply. The divorce papers are being drawn up as we speak. My lawyers will contact yours tomorrow. The prenup makes the financial aspects straightforward, so there's no need for negotiation. Something flickered across James's face. Panic, perhaps, or the first genuine emotion I'd seen from him all evening. Just like that? 8 years tossed? Away without even trying to fix things? Fix things? I echoed. James, you didn't come here tonight to fix our marriage. You came to end it on your terms. The only difference is that I'm changing the terms. And what about Sapphire Bay? He asked, gesturing around us at the luxurious resort. Was bringing us all here just part of your revenge plot? Making me look like a fool in front of everyone? Not revenge, I corrected. Revelation. I wanted everyone to see the truth, not just about your affair, but about who I really am. The woman you thought you were leaving isn't the woman standing before you now. She never really was. I looked around at our stunned family members, some avoiding eye contact out of discomfort, others watching with undisguised interest. I want to apologize to everyone for the dramatic turn this reunion has taken. Please enjoy the resort as my guests for the full week as planned. All accommodations and amenities are covered. And where will you be? My mother asked gently. I have a private villa on the north side of the property, I explained. I'll be staying there, taking some time to process. But I'll join everyone for dinner tomorrow evening, if that's all right. My father stood, coming to stand beside me with a supportive hand on my shoulder. Of course it is. This is your resort, after all. The subtle emphasis on your wasn't lost on anyone, least of all James, whose expression had hardened into something unreadable. As for you two, I said, turning back to James and Melanie, you're welcome to stay as well, though I imagine you might prefer different accommodations under the circumstances. The Coral Reef Resort down the beach is quite lovely. I can have my staff arrange it. You're kicking us out, James stated flatly. No, I replied. I'm giving you a choice. Stay here knowing that everyone now understands exactly what's happened, or relocate somewhere more comfortable. Either way, the honeymoon suite you booked has been reassigned to my aunt and uncle. They've been wanting to renew their vows for their 40th anniversary, and I thought the jacuzzi tub might be better appreciated by a couple with something to actually celebrate. My aunt let out a surprised laugh, while my uncle beamed at the unexpected upgrade. The tension on the terrace fractured slightly, relief seeping through the cracks as the confrontation appeared to be winding down rather than escalating further. James stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the terrace tiles. We'll check out and move to the Coral Reef, he said stiffly. Have your staff arrange it. Of course, I nodded. Maria at the front desk will handle everything. As James turned to leave, Melanie trailing uncertainly behind him, he paused and looked back at me. I never expected this from you, Victoria. I didn't think you had it in you. That was always our fundamental problem, James, I replied softly. You never really saw me at all. After James and Melanie left the terrace, an uncomfortable silence settled over the remaining family members. My mother busied herself adjusting the flower centerpieces that were already perfectly arranged. My father stood motionless, his hands folded on the table, eyes fixed on the space where the portfolio had been. Nicholas had stepped away to call his wife and fill her in on the evening's dramatic turn. Victoria, my aunt finally ventured, her voice gentle. Are you all right, dear? Was I all right? It seemed like such a simple question, yet I found myself unable to formulate a coherent answer. The adrenaline that had carried me through the confrontation was beginning to ebb, leaving behind a strange hollowness that wasn't quite pain, wasn't quite relief, just emptiness where something vital used to be. I think I need a moment, I said, rising from my chair with as much dignity as I could muster. Excuse me. I made my way across the terrace and down the private path that led to the owner's villa, a secluded retreat nestled among tropical gardens at the north end of the Key property. The fragrance of night-blooming jasmine followed me as I walked, the soft landscape lighting illuminating the winding path through lush foliage. The villa had been my grandfather's pride and joy when he first built Sapphire Bay 20 years ago. He'd designed it himself, incorporating elements from his travels, Balinese woodwork, Italian marble, French antiques, creating a space that was both luxurious and deeply personal. When I inherited his property portfolio, this villa had become my secret sanctuary, a place I visited when James thought I was away at nonprofit conferences or donor retreats. Closing the door behind me, I sank onto the edge of the expansive sofa, finally allowing my carefully constructed facade to crumble. My hands, steady throughout the confrontation, now trembled as I pressed them against my face. The tears I'd been holding back didn't come, though. Instead, I felt a strange detachment, as if I were observing someone else's life falling apart rather than my own. I glanced around the villa at the evidence of my true self. The architectural journals stacked neatly on the coffee table. The property development plans spread across the desk in the corner. The wall of photographs documenting resort openings and project completions. This was the Victoria that James had never known. The businesswoman whose financial acumen and strategic thinking rivaled his own. The heiress who had deliberately downplayed her wealth to find someone who loved her for herself rather than her fortune. The irony didn't escape me. In hiding my true financial status, I had inadvertently created the perfect environment for James to diminish me in other ways, assuming I needed him more than he needed me. The power imbalance I'd sought to avoid by concealing my wealth had manifested anyway, just in different forms. My phone buzzed in my pocket, a text from James. "We need to talk privately. This isn't how this should end." I stared at the message, noting how perfectly it encapsulated James's approach to our entire relationship. We need to talk. Not, "I'm sorry," or "I was wrong," or any acknowledgement of the pain he'd caused. Just the assumption that if he could get me alone, he could control the narrative once more. This isn't how this should end. As if there were a proper protocol for concluding a marriage destroyed by betrayal. As if my deviation from his script was the true offense rather than his 10-month affair with my assistant. I didn't respond. Instead, setting the phone face down on the coffee table. James had monopolized enough of my emotional energy. I wouldn't give him a single moment more tonight. A soft knock at the door pulled me from my thoughts. "Victoria, it's Mom. May I come in?" "Yes," I called, straightening my posture and tucking a strand of hair behind my ear, reflexive gestures of composure that seemed pointless now. Elena entered carrying 2 steaming mugs of tea, her face lined with concern, but free of the pity I had dreaded seeing. She set the mugs on the coffee table and sat beside me on the sofa, close enough for comfort, but not so close as to crowd me. My mother had always understood the delicate balance of support and space. "Chamomile with honey," she said, nodding toward the mugs. "Just like when you were little and had a bad day at school." A smile tugged at my lips despite everything. "Some things never change." "And some things do," she replied, her voice gentle but firm. "Sometimes they have to." We sat in silence for a moment, the familiar scent of chamomile filling the room. Outside, I could hear the rhythmic sound of waves breaking on the shore, a soothing backdrop to the turbulence of the evening. "How long have you known?" Elena finally asked, her eyes searching my face. "That something wasn't right between you and James?" I considered the question, trying to pinpoint the exact moment when doubt had first crept in. Had it been when James started working late without explanation? When he began criticizing my clothes, my friends, my interests? When intimacy became rare, then perfunctory, then non-existent? "I think part of me has known for at least a year," I admitted. But I kept making excuses, blaming his stress at work or my own insecurities. It was easier than facing the truth. Elena nodded, understanding, in her eyes. "And Melanie? When did you suspect her involvement? I didn't, I said simply. Not until I found the photos. That part was unexpected. My mother's face tightened, anger flickering across her features. Of all people, your own assistant, someone you mentored, someone you trusted in your home at our family gatherings, all this time. Mom, I interrupted gently. It doesn't matter who it was. If it hadn't been Melanie, it would have been someone else. The problem wasn't her. It was James. It was our marriage. It was a realization that had crystallized for me during those sleepless nights after discovering the affair. Melanie's betrayal hurt, of course. The professional complications made everything messier, more painful. But ultimately, she was a symptom, not the disease itself. The real illness had been growing in my marriage long before she entered the picture. You're right, Elena conceded after a moment. But that doesn't make what she did any less despicable. I reached for my mug, letting the warmth seep into my palms. No, it doesn't. But focusing on her betrayal feels beside the point now. I'm more concerned with how I didn't see what was happening in my own marriage, how I let things deteriorate so badly without confronting them. You can't blame yourself for his choices, Victoria. James's actions are his responsibility alone. I'm not, I assured her. James's decisions are entirely his. But I am responsible for how long I allowed myself to be diminished, for how much of myself I surrendered trying to be what he wanted. Elena's eyes glistened with unshed tears. When did that start? The diminishment? The question struck me with unexpected force. When had it started? Not all at once, certainly. There had been no single moment I could point to and say, there. That's when I began to disappear. It started with small things, I said slowly, memories surfacing. Comments about my clothes being too casual for an investment banker's wife. Suggestions that my nonprofit work was less important than his finance career. Jokes at my expense when we were with friends that I laughed off because I didn't want to seem oversensitive. I took a sip of tea, organizing my thoughts. Then, it progressed to bigger things. He started making decisions without consulting me. Financial choices, vacation plans, even which friends we'd maintain relationships with. If I objected, he'd make me feel irrational or difficult. Why didn't you say something? My mother asked, her voice pained. To me? To your father? To anyone? I smiled sadly. Because I was embarrassed. Because admitting there were problems meant acknowledging that the life I'd been presenting to everyone, this perfect marriage, this perfect partnership, was a facade. And because part of me believed I really was the problem, that if I could just be better, more supportive, more understanding, things would improve. Oh, Victoria, Elena sighed, reaching for my hand. You've always been so independent, so strong-willed. I never imagined you could be made to feel that way. Neither did I admitted. But it happens so slowly you hardly notice. By the time you realize what's happening, you're already lost. We fell silent again, the weight of my words settling between us. Outside, I could hear distant voices as guests moved about the resort, the evening's activities continuing despite the drama that had unfolded on the terrace. What happens now? My mother finally asked. It was the question I'd been asking myself for 2 months, ever since finding those photos. What happens after you dismantle the life you've spent 8 years building? Where do you go when the future you'd planned suddenly evaporates? Now I rebuild, I said, surprising myself with the conviction in my voice. I figure out who Victoria is without James, what she wants, what she dreams about, what makes her happy. And the divorce? My lawyer thinks it will be straightforward. The prenup is solid, especially with the infidelity clause. James might contest some points out of spite, but his legal standing is weak. 3 months, maybe 4, and it will be final. Elena squeezed my hand. You seem remarkably calm about all this. I've had 2 months to process, I reminded her. 2 months of anger, grief, shock, planning. Tonight was just the execution of those plans. Morning light filtered through the sheer curtains of the owner's villa, casting soft patterns across the polished hardwood floors. I'd spent the night there, unable to face the thought of encountering James or Melanie in the resort's public spaces. The king-sized bed with its fine Egyptian cotton sheets had been comfortable enough, but sleep had come in restless fragments, my mind continuously replaying the confrontation on the terrace. I reached for my phone, wincing at the barrage of notifications that had accumulated overnight. 5 missed calls and 12 texts from James, 3 voice messages from Melanie, a string of supportive messages from friends and extended family, who had already heard about last night's dinner. News traveled fast in our social circle. Ignoring them all, I swung my legs over the side of the bed and padded to the adjoining bathroom. The face that greeted me in the mirror was pale but composed, eyes clear despite the minimal sleep. I splashed cold water on my face, the shock of it fully awakening me to the reality of my new situation. I was getting divorced. The thought landed differently in the morning light. Last night it had been a tactical move, a calculated response to James's betrayal. This morning it was simply my future, uncertain, unplanned, but undeniably mine. I borrowed a robe from the hook on the bathroom door and made my way to the villa's kitchen, following the unexpected scent of coffee and fresh pastries. To my surprise, Maria, the resort's head of guest services, was arranging a breakfast tray on the island countertop. "Good morning, Ms. Collins," she said warmly, using my maiden name as she had since I'd purchased the resort. No one on the staff except my personal assistant knew I was married to James Mercer. I had deliberately kept my ownership quiet, allowing the staff to believe I was merely a representative of the investment group that had acquired the property. "Maria, you didn't have to do this," I said, gratefully accepting the cup of coffee. She offered. "It seemed like you could use a quiet breakfast," she replied with a knowing smile. "The resort is buzzing this morning. Your family is enjoying the beach, though Mr. Mercer and Ms. Reynolds checked out at dawn. They asked to have their belongings sent to the coral reef." I nodded, taking a long sip of perfectly brewed coffee. So James and Melanie had made their escape, avoiding the awkwardness of facing everyone after last night's revelations. It was a predictable move. James had never been one to linger in uncomfortable situations. He preferred to retreat, regroup, and reemerge with a new strategy once he'd regained his footing. "Thank you for handling that," I said. "And for breakfast. I appreciate your discretion." After Maria left, I settled on the villa's private terrace with my coffee and a croissant, looking out over the turquoise waters of the bay. A family of dolphins played in the distance, their sleek bodies arcing above the surface before disappearing again into the depths. Their joyful freedom resonated with something awakening inside me, a sense of possibility I hadn't felt in years. My phone buzzed with a call, not James this time, but my lawyer, Rebecca Chen. "Victoria," she greeted me, her voice crisp and professional as always. "I understand from your text that the confrontation happened as planned. How are you holding up?" Better than expected, I admitted. James reacted exactly as we anticipated. Denial, followed by blame shifting, followed by attempts to regain control. And the prenup documentation? He was blindsided, especially by the infidelity clause. I don't think he even remembered it existed until I pointed it out. Rebecca made a satisfied sound. Excellent. I've already prepared the divorce petition, with everything we discussed. Once you're back in the city, we can file immediately. We discussed a few more legal details before ending the call. As I set the phone down, I realized that for the first time in months, I felt a genuine sense of peace. Not happiness, that seemed premature given the circumstances, but a calm certainty that I was finally moving in the right direction. The path ahead wouldn't be simple. James wouldn't simply disappear from my life. The divorce proceedings would ensure that we remained connected, at least legally, for months to come. There would be challenges, both practical and emotional. There would be moments of doubt, of fear, of wondering whether I was making the right choice. But as I sipped my coffee, watching the sunlight dance across the gentle waves, I felt more certain than I had in years. This wasn't just about leaving James. It was about finding Victoria again. And that journey, however difficult, was long, overdue. I spent the morning walking the pristine shoreline of the bay, the warm sand between my toes and the rhythmic sound of waves providing a natural therapy no counselor could match. The beach was dotted with resort guests, families building sandcastles, couples reading under umbrellas, solo travelers meditating in the morning sun, all blissfully unaware of the drama that had unfolded among the resort's owner and her family the previous night. Near the northern point of the bay, I spotted Nicholas sitting alone on a rock formation, staring out at the horizon. My brother had always sought solitude when processing difficult situations. As children, while I would confront problems head-on, Nicholas would retreat to think, emerging only when he had fully formed his response. "Mind if I join you?" I called, approaching the rocks. He looked up, a smile breaking through his contemplative expression. "It's your resort. I don't think I can stop you." I climbed up, taking a seat beside him on the sun-warmed stone. "About that. I'm sorry I never told you about the resort, about grandfather's business." Nicholas shrugged. "You don't owe me an explanation. We all have our reasons for the choices we make. Still, you're my brother. We used to tell each other everything. And then we grew up," he said simply. "We built separate lives, developed separate coping mechanisms. You became more private, more self-contained. I focused on my medical career, started a family." I picked up a small shell fragment, turning it over in my palm. "When did you first suspect something was wrong between James and me?" Nicholas considered the question, his gaze returning to the horizon. "Christmas, maybe? You were both there physically, but the connection was missing. You used to finish each other's sentences, share private jokes. Suddenly you were more like polite acquaintances sharing the same space." His observation struck me with unexpected force. Christmas had been nearly a year ago, months before James began his affair with Melanie. Nicholas had noticed the fractures in our marriage before I'd fully acknowledged them myself. "Why didn't you say anything?" I asked. "Would you have listened?" His question wasn't accusatory, just matter of fact. "You've always been fiercely independent, Vic. Even as a kid, you wanted to figure things out for yourself. Remember when Dad tried to teach you to ride a bike and you insisted on doing It without training wheels on the first day? I smiled at the memory. I had a lot of scrapes and bruises that summer. But you learned to ride faster than any of us, Nicholas pointed out. That's always been your way. Difficult path, steep learning curve, but ultimately successful. We sat in companionable silence for a while, watching the waves crash against the rocks below us. The rhythmic sound was hypnotic, soothing. I'm proud of you, Nicholas said finally. Not just for how you handled last night, though that was impressive. I'm proud of your success, this resort, your business acumen, everything you've built while pretending to be just a nonprofit director. It wasn't entirely pretense, I corrected. The nonprofit work is real, meaningful. I just happen to have other interests too. Why hide it from James, though? I understand keeping a low profile publicly, but from your husband. It was a question I'd asked myself many times over the past 8 years, especially during the last few months as our marriage deteriorated. The answer wasn't simple. When I met James, I'd just experienced a string of relationships where men were more interested in my inheritance than in me, I explained. One actually proposed after finding out about my trust fund, despite the fact that we'd only been dating for 3 weeks. So you tested James by hiding your wealth, Nicholas deduced. Initially, yes. I wanted to know he loved me for myself, not my money. Then, as time passed, it became harder to reveal the truth. How do you tell someone you've been hiding a significant part of yourself for years? What would that say about the foundation of your relationship? Nicholas nodded thoughtfully. So you compartmentalized. Victoria, the nonprofit director at home, Victoria, the property mogul at work. Exactly, and in some ways, it made things easier. James never questioned my frequent business trips because he thought they were fundraising efforts or conferences. He never worried about our finances because he assumed he was the primary breadwinner, which satisfied his ego. But it created distance, my brother observed. Yes, I acknowledged. A gap that grew wider with time, filled with unspoken truths and assumptions. By the time I realized how problematic it had become, we were already drifting apart in other ways. Nicholas put an arm around my shoulders, a gesture of solidarity we hadn't shared in years. For what it's worth, I think you're making the right decision now. Not just about the divorce, but about reclaiming all the parts of yourself you've kept separate. His words resonated deeply. That was exactly what this moment represented. Not just the end of my marriage, but the integration of my fragmented selves. The businesswoman, the philanthropist, the heiress, the woman who had been diminished in her personal relationship, but thrived in her professional one. Thank you, I said simply. That means more than you know. As the afternoon sun climbed higher, we made our way back toward the resort, stopping at the beachfront bar for refreshments. Several family members were gathered there, my parents sharing a fruit platter, my aunt and uncle exploring the cocktail menu, Timothy sitting slightly apart, his expression troubled. James's brother had been notably quiet during last night's confrontation. As the person who had known about the affair and said nothing, he now seemed unsure of his place in the family gathering. I approached him, 2 coconut waters in hand, offering one as a peace offering. Mind if I join you? Timothy looked up, surprise and wariness battling in his expression. You sure you want to? I'm probably not your favorite person right now. Your family, I said simply, taking the seat beside him. That doesn't change because you kept your brother's secret. He accepted the coconut water but couldn't meet my eyes. I should have told you. I knew it was wrong not to. Why didn't you? I asked, genuinely curious rather than accusatory. Timothy sighed, running a hand through his hair, a gesture so similar to James's that it sent an unexpected pang through me. Loyalty, I guess. James is my brother. We've always had each other's backs, even when one of us was wrong. He paused, finally looking at me directly. But this was different. This crossed a line I shouldn't have helped him cross. I nodded, understanding the complex pull of sibling loyalty. Did you try to talk him out of it? The affair, I mean. Multiple times, Timothy admitted. When he first told me, I thought it was just a crush, something that would pass. By the time I realized how serious it was, how far it had gone. He trailed off, shaking his head. I should have tried harder. Should have threatened to tell you myself. It might not have changed anything, I offered, surprised by my own generosity toward him. James makes his own decisions. Always. Still, I owed you more, Timothy insisted. After everything you've done for Michael and me, helping us with the adoption process, being such a supportive sister-in-law, I betrayed that. I thought about Timothy and his husband, how they had struggled for years to adopt a child, how I had connected them with a lawyer specializing in LGBTQ+ family formation, how James had been reluctant to get involved, claiming it was their personal business. You're right, I said finally. You did owe me more, but holding on to anger about it doesn't serve either of us now. Timothy looked relieved, though still burdened. What happens next? With you and James, I mean. Divorce, I said simply. Clean, as quick as possible, guided by the prenup. And us? The family connections? It was a question I hadn't fully considered yet, how divorce would reshape my relationship with James's family. Timothy and Michael had become dear to me over the years, as had Diana and Richard in their own way, despite their knowledge of James's affair. We adapt, I decided. I'm not divorcing you or Michael. We'll figure out new boundaries, new traditions maybe. It might be awkward at first, but we'll navigate it. Timothy's eyes welled unexpectedly. I was afraid we'd lose you entirely, that James's actions would cost us your presence in our lives. His vulnerability touched me deeply. In focusing on the betrayal of my husband and assistant, I hadn't fully considered how the fallout would affect others who had become family to me, how they too might fear abandonment in the wake of the divorce. Family isn't just defined by marriage certificates, I assured him. It's defined by the connections we build, the history we share, the care we take with each other, even when we make mistakes. Even big ones? He asked, a hint of his usual humor returning. Even big ones, I confirmed, though perhaps a little groveling wouldn't hurt. For the first time since arriving at the resort, Timothy laughed, the sound breaking through the tension that had surrounded him. I can grovel with the best of them. Just ask Michael about the great anniversary forgotten of 2019. As we continued chatting, joined eventually by other family members, I felt something shift inside me, a recognition that ending my marriage didn't mean ending all the relationships associated with it. I could choose which connections to maintain, which to reshape, which to release entirely. That agency, that selective curation of my life going forward, was yet another form of reclaiming my power. The remainder of the afternoon passed pleasantly, with family members dispersing to enjoy the resort's amenities. My parents went snorkeling with my aunt and uncle. Nicholas joined a beach volleyball game, and Timothy went to call Michael, who was arriving the next day. I took the opportunity to visit the resort's management office, tucked discreetly behind the main reception area. Carlos, the general manager I'd hired 3 years ago when I acquired the property, greeted me warmly. "Ms. Collins, I didn't realize you were visiting. The quarterly review isn't until next month." "This is a personal trip, Carlos," I explained, "though I'd love a brief update on operations while I'm here." For the next hour, I lost myself in the familiar rhythm of business discussions, occupancy rates, customer satisfaction scores, upcoming renovations, staffing changes. The clarity and purpose I felt in these conversations highlighted the stark contrast with my personal life's current turbulence. In business, I had always been direct, confident, decisive, the very qualities that had gradually diminished in my relationship with James. Here, my expertise was valued, my opinion sought, rather than dismissed. I moved through the world of property management and hospitality development with an assurance that had somehow never translated to my marriage. "The new eco initiative has been particularly successful," Carlos was saying, showing me data on the solar panel installation. "We've reduced energy costs by 22% while enhancing our sustainability credentials. The marketing team has leveraged it effectively with environmentally conscious travelers." "Excellent," I nodded, reviewing the figures. "Let's look at expanding it to the West Wing during the next renovation cycle. And what about the community engagement program?" "Thriving. The local artisan marketplace every Saturday brings in both guests and locals. We're creating exactly the kind of community integration you envisioned." Pride swelled within me as I toured the property with Carlos, seeing the manifestation of my vision everywhere, from the thoughtfully designed family areas to the adults-only. Tranquility gardens, from the farm-to-table restaurant to the cultural heritage displays in the lobby. This resort wasn't just a business investment. It was a creation that reflected my values, my aesthetic sensibilities, my commitment to responsible tourism and community support. It was, in many ways, a more authentic expression of my true self than the marriage I had maintained for 8 years. As sunset approached, I returned to the villa to prepare for dinner. I had promised to join the family, to demonstrate that despite the previous evening's drama, I was moving forward with strength rather than retreating in hurt or embarrassment. I chose a simple but elegant blue maxi dress, a recent purchase, that James had never seen, one that represented my own taste rather than his preferences. As I applied light makeup and styled my hair in loose waves, I studied my reflection, trying to see myself through fresh eyes. The woman looking back at me wasn't the same one who had walked into this resort yesterday, braced for confrontation, but still somehow defined by her relationship to James. This woman stood independently, her worth no longer tied to her husband's perception or approval. My phone buzzed with another text from James. "We need to talk face to face. There are things you don't understand. I'm at the Coral Reef, Suite 312. I read the message twice, noting the familiar pattern, no apology, just an assumption that I didn't understand the situation properly, that if he could explain in person, I might see things differently. Classic James, always believing in his power to persuade, to reshape perceptions to align with his preferred narrative. For a brief moment, I considered going, not to reconcile, but to hear whatever justification he had concocted, to witness firsthand his attempts to reframe the narrative of our marriage and its ending. Curiosity tugged at me, but wisdom pulled stronger. I deleted the message without responding. Whatever James needed to say could be communicated through our lawyers. I had already given him 8 years of my attention, my accommodation, my diminishment. I wouldn't give him another evening. Instead, I texted Nicholas, "Heading to dinner in 10. Save me a seat?" His response came immediately. "Already did. Mom's ordered champagne. Apparently we're celebrating your emancipation, her word not. Mine." I smiled, tucking the phone into my clutch. This was where my energy belonged now, with people who supported my growth rather than constraining it, who celebrated my strength rather than requiring my submission. As I walked through the lush tropical gardens toward the resort's premier restaurant, I felt lighter with each step, as if I were physically shedding the weight of pretense and compromise I'd carried for years. The evening breeze caressed my skin, carrying the mingled scents of jasmine and sea salt, nature's perfume, heady and pure. The restaurant's private dining terrace overlooked the bay, now painted in spectacular sunset hues of gold, crimson, and violet. My family had already gathered, champagne flutes glinting in the warm lighting from hurricane lanterns placed strategically around the space. My mother spotted me first, rising to embrace me as I approached. "You look radiant," she whispered, stepping back to admire my dress. "Truly yourself." Those 2 words, "truly yourself," resonated deeply. How long had it been since I'd felt fully authentic, undivided between the different roles I played? The business owner, the philanthropist, the wife, the daughter. All separate facets that rarely intersected. Now, standing before my family without secrets or compartmentalization, I felt a wholeness that had eluded me for years. "Thank you all for being here," I said as I took my seat, looking around at the faces of those who had witnessed last night's confrontation and chosen to stand with me in its aftermath. I know this isn't exactly the family vacation any of us planned. "Best family reunion ever," Nicholas quipped, raising his champagne glass. "I mean, it has everything. Drama, revelations, a villain getting his comeuppance. We should do this every year." Laughter rippled around the table, breaking, the last of the tension that had lingered since the previous evening. Even Timothy joined in, the burden of guilt visibly lighter on his shoulders. My father stood, lifting his glass in a toast. "To Victoria," he said, his voice steady and proud, "who reminded us all last night what true strength looks like. Not the absence of vulnerability, but the courage to stand in your truth even when it's difficult." "To Victoria," the others echoed, glasses raised. As dinner progressed, exquisite local seafood, tropical fruits, fine wine, conversation flowed easily, deliberately steering away from James and toward future plans. My mother discussed her upcoming book on relationship psychology, Nicholas, shared stories about his hospital work. My aunt and uncle debated potential destinations for their anniversary trip. It struck me how rarely James had participated in these family discussions, how he had always seemed slightly removed, checking his phone or steering conversation back to his work achievements. His absence tonight didn't create a void. Rather, it allowed space for deeper connections, for stories and laughter that might have been constrained by his presence. "So, Victoria," my aunt asked over dessert, "what's next for you? After the divorce is finalized, I mean." It was the question I'd been asking myself since discovering James's betrayal. What did I want my life to look like on the other side of this ending? "Honestly, I'm not entirely sure yet," I admitted. "But I know I want integration rather than compartmentalization. No more separate selves for separate contexts." "What does that mean practically?" Timothy asked, genuinely interested. I considered the question, articulating thoughts that had been forming since the confrontation. It means being open about my business ventures instead of hiding them. It means possibly expanding my nonprofit work to include financial literacy programs for women leaving difficult relationships. It means reconnecting with parts of myself I've set aside. My writing, my interest in architectural preservation, my desire to travel not as someone's wife, but as myself. My mother nodded approvingly. Renaissance rather than reconstruction. Exactly, I agreed, the phrase capturing perfectly what I envisioned. Not rebuilding what was lost, but flourishing in new directions, allowing dormant aspects of myself to blossom alongside established strengths. As dinner concluded and we moved to the lounge area for coffee and digestives, I felt a profound sense of gratitude for this unexpected gift. The opportunity to reimagine my life entirely on my own terms, surrounded by people who supported that. Reinvention, without trying to shape it according to their expectations. The path ahead wasn't clearly marked. There would be difficult days, legal complications, emotional aftershocks from 8 years of marriage suddenly ended. James wouldn't simply fade away. The divorce proceedings would ensure continued interaction, at least through our attorneys. But standing on that terrace, watching stars emerge over the tranquil waters of the bay, I felt a certainty that had eluded me for years. Whatever challenges lay ahead, I would face them as my complete self. No longer fragmented, no longer diminished, no longer defined by someone else's perception. For the first time in perhaps my entire adult life, I was authoring my own story, rather than playing a supporting role in someone else's. And despite the pain that had preceded this moment, I couldn't help but recognize it for what it truly was. Not just an ending, but a magnificent beginning. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.